Psalm 2. Why do the nations conspire and the people plot in vain? The kings of the earth rise up and the rulers band together against the Lord and against his anointed, saying, let us break their chains and throw off their shackles. The one enthroned in heaven laughs. The Lord scoffs at them. He rebukes them in his anger and terrifies them in his wrath, saying, I have installed my king on Zion, my holy mountain. I will proclaim the Lord's decree. He said to me, you are my son. Today I have become your father. Ask me, and I will make the nations your inheritance, the ends of the earth your possession. You will break them with a rod of iron. You will dash them to pieces like pottery. Therefore, you kings, be wise, be warned, you rulers of the earth. Serve the Lord with fear and celebrate his rule with trembling. Kiss his son, or he will be angry, and your way will lead to your destruction. For his wrath can flare up in a moment. Blessed are all who take refuge in him.
Well, today we're continuing in our look at the introduction to the book of Psalms. So last week we read Psalm 1. Today we're looking at Psalm 2. And it's pretty commonly thought that these two psalms actually work together as like a mini introduction to the book of the whole Psalms. So the image is, and if you read the bulletin, I gave this away, that it's like a house with two pillars at the front that you walk through. If you've been over to the curate's cottage, it has like two little like pillory things at the front door. Imagine that. Thanks, curate's cottage, for having two pillars at the front there. They're not very attractive at the curate's cottage, but imagine these like really big, attractive pillars of the book. It's the start of the book of Psalms. Now that sounds quite nice, and then we read Psalm 2, and it's quite intense, isn't it? If you've read Psalm 1, you're like, oh, this sounds nice. There's like a nice tree growing, and it's by a river, and it's like healthy, and there's fruit, provides some nice shade. And then Psalm 2, it's a bit of a contrast, isn't it? Yep. So let's have a look in and see what is going on here. Like, how do these fit together? Because if they make a nice introduction, it doesn't feel like they have much in common at this point, does it? It feels like there's a bit more drama going on in Psalm 2. If you've got a Bible app on your phone, you might want to open that. I won't take it personally if it looks like you're texting, it's fine. But I feel like today we're going to have a look at this psalm that is all about sort of how does God respond to the nations as a whole. If Psalm 1 is sort of looking at our individual relationship with God, Psalm 2 is a lot more about the nations and God. How does God respond to strength and also anger and those who reject him? And I think the thing that ties these two psalms together is that actually Psalm 1 starts with a blessing and Psalm 2 ends with a blessing. It's like those two bookends that is why scholars sort of think that these two work together. So, we're going to look at this in some little sections. Verse 1 to 3, I've called it rage. There's some nice rage going on in verses 1 to 3. If you're going to have all the themes, all the emotions in the Psalms, you've got to have some rage going on in there as well, because let's be clear, rage is an emotion and sometimes we feel it. The nations are angry and they just don't hold back in these first few verses. The thing is, we're not really told why they're angry. Why are they plotting against God? We don't know. They are conspiring together, though, against the Lord and his anointed. And we even hear that the kings of the earth band together to do this. They feel so strongly against God that they put aside their individual grievances to work together. There's no holding back. And I think it's worth noting here that often the kings of the earth were warring against each other. And in this moment, they're like, we're going to put aside our grievances so that we can work together in this moment. These kings and rulers feel like they have been chained and shackled. And yet, verse 1 tells us that their rebellion is in vain. They can't succeed against God. And it's also important to note that this isn't because God is a tyrant. Later in verse 8, we hear that God gives the nations as an inheritance to his people. God loves his people. He rules with care. What we're seeing in these first few verses of rage is a rejection of God's loving rule. The people want to be their own king. They don't want any other God but themselves. And so, to use our language from last week, we talked about walking towards Jesus and then walking away from Jesus. These kings are choosing to walk away from God. So, verses 1 to 3, some rage. We move on to verses 4 to 6, and we see a rebuke. How does God respond to threats of war or violence? It's rebuke. He doesn't roll over or submit to these threats. He doesn't enter into negotiation. God rebukes those who are acting in violence, meaningless violence. He doesn't allow insurrection. We're actually told this is such a ludicrous plot from these kings that God laughs. He scoffs at this idea that the kings could take over God's reign. And verse 6 tells us that God will support his chosen king that he's put in Jerusalem. God is a God of justice and authority. Well, let's keep going through. We're going through pretty quickly here. Verse 7 to 12, we'll look at this in a bit more detail. We see what God's righteous reign actually looks like. Now, this second half of the psalm does change tack a bit more. Gives us a bit more detail about what does God's justice and authority actually look like. And I feel like this bit is pretty important because if we just had those first 6 verses, it would be a bit intense, right? It is quite intense because basically it would sort of be this battle between what looks like a mean, stubborn God and then mean, stubborn kings. It's probably not a place that any of us, I think, would want to live in. It's quite harsh. I said last week, the Psalms is full of all the emotions, and we get that right here in the introduction. But thankfully, I think verses 7 to 12 give us a bit more detail about God's plan. In verse 7 to 9, we hear that from the king that God has placed to rule. God rules through this king. This king is one who does choose to follow God. And we hear that God has called him a son. And God is his father. The nations are an inheritance. The earth, all the ends of the earth are his possession. Now this is a really positive contrast. This is meant to conjure up an image of loving kindness in this rule. God has placed a king to rule with earthly authority. And this leadership, compared to these other kings, this is leadership that has God's wisdom, justice, and mercy. Now we get this funny little phrase in verse 9 that says, "You will rule them with a rod of iron," or break them with a rod of iron. Now that's a really harsh sort of phrase there, isn't it? And when I think of the word rod, does anyone else think of a school cane? Thankfully, so I trained as a teacher and taught for a couple of years, and we definitely do not use the cane anymore. This is a good move for the school classroom that we do not cane children. This is not the sort of cane that we're talking about. Whew, good. Okay, so this is the sort of cane we're talking about. Think like a shepherd's crook rod. Yep. So I had to do some Googling about all the things that you could do with a shepherd's staff this week. Turns out you learn a lot when you read the Psalms. So it's that long stick with the hook at the top. Oh yeah, people on Zoom can see it too. Cool. So this was used by shepherds for a whole lot of things. It makes a really good walking stick, which is helpful because shepherds do a lot of walking. But they also manage their flock of sheep with it. So you can my arms are pretty short, but if you're also holding this long stick here, you can gather sheep. Sheep are pretty wayward, so, you need long arms to keep the sheep in check. I feel like Nathan should be giving this talk about sheep. Sorry, Nathan. Nathan can correct us afterwards about how to manage sheep. But also they can be used if you're trying to catch a sheep, if you're trying to help a sheep out of a ditch. You can be used to defend the sheep against attack. This is a very useful stick. I'm really sorry, Nathan, if I got this wrong. This is what the internet told me about shepherds' staffs. And yes, obviously it was very helpful for the shepherds themselves. They could lean on it. They could use it as a walking stick. And I have a fun Anglican fact because I'm an Anglican nerd. This shepherd's staff is actually, when the bishop comes and the bishop has a long stick, this is what this is based on. Fun fact. Let's move on quickly. So this rod is actually a really positive image. This rod of iron is an image of love and care and protection, like a shepherd looking after their sheep. It's not like a school teacher back in the day with a stick that they hit kids with. We don't want that. We want the shepherd's stick who is caring for the sheep. God has provided it. This king that God has provided for the people is there to be like a shepherd caring for the flock, to rule justly, and only when absolutely necessary would any sort of force be used. If they're under attack, or, when the kid runs out on the road, that's when you grab them to stop them from running out on the road. When the sheep is running into a ditch, that's when you stop them. So when we continue to read through the rest of the psalm, we see that all of this is under God's ultimate authority and control. So verse 10, if you've got it there, says, "Therefore you kings, be wise, be warned, you rulers of the earth. Serve the Lord with fear and celebrate his rule with trembling." All of this instruction about God's plan is leading to the final blessing that comes at the end of the psalm. Blessed are those who take refuge in him. So in contrast to the kings of the earth who are conspiring for war, God is in control of the whole earth and is giving a blessing to those who take refuge in him. Now, these verses aren't just a nice description of God's chosen king compared to the kings of the day. These verses are pointing us forward to Jesus. They are a prophetic word. Verse 7 is referred to 7 times in the New Testament, teaching us that Jesus is God's Son, his chosen king to rule over all. We see it in Hebrews 1. This verse is quoted, "You have become my son. Today I have become your father." And it goes on to explain what sort of ruler, what sort of king Jesus will be. So Hebrews 1:8 says, about the Son, God says, "Your throne, O God, will last forever and ever. A scepter of justice will be the scepter of your kingdom. You have loved righteousness and hated wickedness. Therefore God, your God, has set you above your companions by anointing you, Jesus, with the oil of joy." Jesus is this king that is talked about, anointed by God to rule forever. He is a ruler who loves righteousness and justice, a ruler who hates wickedness. This is who Psalm 2 is pointing towards. It's pointing to Jesus. Jesus who gives us refuge, the one who came to save, to bring hope to the hopeless, light to the darkness, justice to those in despair. Now, if Psalm 1 is giving us a choice about who to follow and who to walk towards, that's the language we used last week, I think Psalm 2 is showing us that God is worth following. God is sovereign and in control in a world that is pretty chaos. In a world that is complex, where difficult situations are going on. Now, there were certainly difficult situations going on in the time of Psalm 2 when that was written, but it's actually not hard for us to think of difficult situations going on here and now, in the last week, the last year, the last couple of years. This week, we've heard about some pretty horrific fires in LA. There are many places around the world that are experiencing war and conflict. There are some pretty challenging things going on around the world, aren't there? And I think it begs us to ask the question, what does it mean for us to believe in a God who is in control, yet all these terrible things are happening? Is God sovereign? What does that look like? How do we hold those two things? Can we take refuge in God? Is he providing blessing? What does that mean? And I think this feels really close to home, doesn't it, when we see such hard things happening in the world. It's important that we don't minimize the suffering that's happening in the world with some trite answer of, well, it's okay, God's in control. And I hope that's not what you hear, and I don't think that's what our psalm is doing. Because I think actually what our psalm is trying to show us is this big picture view of God at work in the world, this long term from creation to restoration. God is in control, not just in one moment, but in the whole of history. And I think we're encouraged here to see that God has it all in view. Sometimes we actually only stop to look at one moment. If we look at the news right now, it's hard. I find it devastating. But when we look at the arc of world history, we see God at work, working for justice and mercy in the world that he has created. So I want to give you one example of this, a thing that I think we see where God is at work and in control, and we can see this working towards restoration, to reconciliation. And it's actually in the work of childhood poverty, extreme childhood poverty around the world. Now, we should note there is a long way to go in this area. But a report was written in 2022 that was created by the World Bank Group and UNICEF that estimates between 2013 and 2022 there was a drop in the rate of extreme childhood poverty, which I think they note is children living on it's like $1.70 a day or less. There was a drop in the rate from 20.7% to 15.9%. Now that doesn't sound like a huge amount, but that number equates to 49.2 million children not living in extreme poverty. Like, that's wild, isn't it? 49.2 million fewer children not living in extreme poverty in 10 years. And it should be noted in that report that covers the years of COVID, and they think that if COVID hadn't happened, that would include something like double that amount. So even with COVID happening, they still managed to reduce that amount by sort of almost 5%. Like, that's wild. That is the work of justice and mercy happening in the world. And they also included in that report that in the 20-year period from the 2000s to sort of the 2020s, those in children in developing countries who experience at least one severe deprivation fell from 70% to 40%. Like again, aren't those numbers staggering? Like let us note, it is still staggering that so many children live in poverty around the world. Like there is a lot of work still to go. But when we look at the overarching story, children in the history of the world have, I just feel so strongly about working with kids. Children in the arc of history basically have been treated like slaves, like less than slaves. They're property. And now entire organisations dedicate their time and effort to reduce the rates of extreme childhood poverty. And we see that in numbers in the millions and the billions. Like, that is the arc of justice and mercy and God at work in the world. And one final note, because it's exciting, that so many of these non-for-profits, like the vast majority of these non-for-profits, were started by Christians. This is the work of Genesis 1, where we see every person, no matter their age and stage, as made in the image of God. Every person deserves basic human rights. They are worthy of dignity and respect. You know, I love that the kids here feel like they can run around, roll on the stage during the music. Every child deserves that, a place to call home. And I think this is God at work in the world, God working through people. And I just think that's one example. Is God devastated by the children currently living in poverty? Absolutely. It breaks his heart. Is God sovereign and in control? Definitely. God will not let wickedness and evil reign indefinitely. And sometimes we see immediate answers to prayer about injustice. Sometimes those prayers take weeks, years, lifetime, or all of eternity. And so I think Psalm 2 offers us this certainty that we can take refuge in God. Jesus offers us hope and salvation. We can bring our requests and concerns about the world to him, knowing that God is in control of all of these things. We're actually going to stop and pray. We're going to practice that. Practice trusting that God is in control of the biggest things in the world. So we're going to spend some time in some small groups. There has been so much going on in the world. If you need some help, you could probably just open your news app on your phone. There is so much going on in the world right now that we could pray for, to ask for God's justice and mercy. Bring to God what is on your heart. Let's spend some time praying.